This day is forever remembered by thousands and thousands of people. I am sure it is memorable to everyone in detail, in the details of even the most insignificant. And not because it was then that we realized the inevitability and the horror of what had happened, but because it seems to me in each of the days stretching from June of the 41st to May of the 45th year, we all thought about the life that was left behind, and of course the last days, hours, minutes of this life, joyful, happy, peaceful. We all went over them in our memories an infinite number of times, and they seemed especially beautiful. That day was sunny, a nice summer Sunday. Early in the morning I drove to a shooting and hunting stand which was near Strelna by the bay, in the neighborhood of Znamenka. Competitions for the city championship were held there. At that time I was the head of the Educational and Sports Department of the City Committee for Physical Culture and Sports, and taught part-time at the Department of Physical Education at the Leningrad Institute of Railway Engineers. I got to the stand for the first time, and the organizers of the championship enthusiastically explained to me the rules of the competition. They showed me the workshop for the production of flying skeet targets, the work of throwing devices, introduced me to the athletes. The composition of the participants was interesting. Young, strong guys, and next to elderly men and even old men, women, young girls, and very young boys of 12 or 15 years old. Students, workers, scientists, artists, engineers, school children, employees. I got acquainted with one of the most passionate enthusiasts of this sport, the chairman of the Bencrest shooting section, Evgeny Mikhailovich Glinternik. He was also known for writing fascinating hunting stories. Subsequently, we worked together for many years. Here I also got acquainted with the artist Alexander Alexandrovich Blinkov, also a passionate stand builder. He, by the way, has not left his affection to this day. A few months later, our paths converged in partisan cry. The shooting competition is in full swing. Shots are rattling, blown to small pieces flying targets. With excitement count the results. The audience's violent reaction to good luck, and no less violent reaction to mistakes. In short, the boiling atmosphere of the competition. And the sky is cloudless, quiet, and hot. Only a strange detail, a surprisingly large number of airplanes in the air. On the way home, I noticed some groups of people near Kirovsky factory. Some of them have gas mask bags over their shoulders, some kind of excitement. However, I was too fascinated by the first time I saw the competition and looked out the window absent-mindedly. The next picture in my memories is the return home. I'm told that the committee called me several times. They asked me to contact them immediately. I dial the number, and it is a deafening news. The sports committee was then located on the Fontanka River, in the building that now houses the House of Doself. Half an hour for the road, a few more minutes of waiting. Then in the office of the chairman of the committee A. Gusev began the meeting. So the essence of the matter, the restructuring of the work of the Committee on Physical Culture and Sports, taking into account the conditions of war team. And, as often happens in cases of sharp changes in the situation, no one, including the chairman, does not really know what is really necessary, what is paramount, and what is less important. Now naive and strange ideas that were put forward that day will seem naive and strange. The preparation of a reserve for the army by sports specialists, the organization of therapeutic gymnastics in military hospitals and other similar ideas. But who knew in those hours the scale of what had happened? I remembered the Finnish War. After all, I had just returned home. I remembered the snows of the Karelian Isthmus, one of our desperate attacks under the dagger machine gun fire of a Finnish pillbox, when I was lying in the snow in the middle of a bare field and knew for sure that if not this, so the next turn would surely get me. But the machine gun choked, and I could not believe for a long time that the battle was over, and I was out of it. More pillboxes, dozens of pillboxes on generally counted kilometers, and fights. But now there was much more terrible things to come. A war with an enemy that had conquered almost all of Europe, with colossal military power. By the end of the meeting, I already knew for sure. Everything that had just been said, we had to do in peacetime. And now we need to think about something else. With the organization of therapeutic gymnastics, we'll cope with old men and women. But I be a man. I, thank God, not 70, but 34. And therefore my place in the ranks. At night, the first air alarm. My wife and I left the house on the International Prospect and looked for a long time into the bright summer sky. Airplanes were buzzing, but it was impossible to understand what was happening in the air. On Senya Square, people gathered in groups, excitedly discussing something, arguing. Different opinions about the announced alarm, optimism and pessimism, calmness and nervousness, and yet it was almost a peaceful picture. The war was still just reaching out its hand to Leningrad. Many years later, I learned that night over Leningrad, the battery of Senior Lieutenant Timkov at 1 hour and 45 minutes was shot down the first enemy bomber U-88. In the morning, in the military enlistment office, I asked to go to the front. There is a hustle and bustle. Hundreds of people besiege the offices, but only very few people get the directions with the addresses of the collection points of the mobilized. And no matter how fervent the others are, they have to leave with nothing. "Wait, we'll call you." The same words were said to me. Being disappointed, I went to work. I was angry listening to conversations about what the committee would do in wartime. I walked around like a stranger. It seemed that women and old men looked at me with reproach and were about to say, "Why are you hanging around here, young man? Why aren't you at the front?" I remember in those days I met an old man in the street. He was coming out of the field of Mars, walking in a businesslike and firm manner. He had a long old man's beard, and on his chest 3 St. George's crosses. It was the first time I saw a man with awards at the SARS time. I was surprised at first, and then I thought, the awards are combat awards. They were received for bravery in the defense of the motherland. Is it surprising that the old man hung on his chest insignia of military distinction? No, he was just reminding us of the military glory of Russia. He is a patriot, and he showed his attitude to the war, even in his own old man way, but clearly. I learned that one of my acquaintances received a summons and went to the front. Then another, and the military enlistment office told me again, "Wait, don't interfere." I finally realized what was going on. Since I continued to work at the Institute of Railway Transport Engineers, I was on special account. Mikhail Mikhailovich Panfilov was the head of the institute at that time, so I went to him and immediately received an offer to head the institute's defense, as there were already instructions from above. "What defense, Mikhail Mikhailovich?" I was surprised. What should we do? It turned out that during air raids this service will have to organize firefighting and something in the same vein. I categorically refused. Then, having contacted the party committee, Panfilov offered me something else, to lead 2 battalions composed of students of the 4th and 5th courses, which were to go to the restoration of railroad junctions, stations and tracks destroyed by enemy aircraft, apparently at somewhere far away, in the area of military operations, so it looks like the real deal. And the paperwork didn't take long. I told the committee that I was going to the front. I told my wife that I was urgently leaving for the construction of engineering structures somewhere on the Karelian Isthmus. I knew it. That's exactly what we were sent for, and that's exactly where we were sent, to the old Finnish border, to the very section where I had joined the Finnish War just a year and a half ago as a member of the 588th Rifle Regiment. I was then the chief of the engineering service. I knew, of course, what defensive structures were. Now it was here that we began to build pillboxes, bunkers, escarpments, and counter-escarpments. We jokingly called this defensive line Liechtenstein Line, a hint that it would not yield to the famous Mannerheim Line. We built it with enthusiasm, built it well. But frankly speaking, I still haven't found out what role in the defense of the city was played by what we did. True, somewhere in those places the enemy's offensive was stopped, and maybe our work helped the army to some extent. I said that we worked with enthusiasm, but I think I was not the only one who internally protested against such an assignment for myself. We got, in general, not where we wanted to go. Days passed. We caught every message from the fronts on the radio, read newspapers with a fever, and, as I became convinced later, we knew very little. And on the 11th day of the war, July 3, Stalin's speech, "Comrades, citizens, brothers and sisters, fighters of our army and navy, I am addressing you, my friends. The treacherous attack of Hitler's Germany on our homeland, launched on June 22, continues. The enemy continues to advance. A serious danger hangs over our motherland. The country has entered a deadly battle with its worst and most insidious enemy, German fascism, together with the Red Army. The entire Soviet people is rising to the defense of the motherland. It is necessary that our people, the Soviet people, realize the depth of the danger, to renounce complacency, carelessness, so that in our ranks there was no place for whiners and cowards. panickers and deserters, so that our people knew no fear in the struggle. We must immediately restructure all our work on a military basis, subordinating everything to the interests of the front and the tasks of organizing the defeat of the enemy. In the areas occupied by the enemy, we must create partisan detachments, create people's militia to raise all the workers to the struggle. Everyone listened to this speech, and everyone remembered it firmly and for a long time, because for the first time people learned then the bitter truth about the plight of our country, and also because this speech armed everyone with a clear and precise program of action. Our battalions were urgently transferred to Leningrad. In the auditorium of the Institute held a general meeting, reported the head of the Department of Marxism-Leninism, associate professor, a member of the party committee Sergei Mikhailovich Grishukov. The party committee called on students and teachers to join the Army of the People's Militia, so I received a referral to the division of the Oktyabrysky district. It seemed that everything finally falls into place, that my future fate becomes more or less clear, but it only. In the evening of the next day we were hastily built in the courtyard of the dormitory, from the line called all those who had combat experience, participants of the Civil War, the Finnish War, the fighting on Khalkhin Gol, Hazar. It turned out that there were 40 to 50 of them in the regiment. All of us were ordered to gather in the club room, and here the commander of the regiment said that he was instructed by the regional party committee to offer all those who had military experience to take part in combat work behind enemy lines. The proposal was completely unexpected. We vaguely imagined in those days where the front line was, but we firmly believed in the strength of the Red Army. And I, for example, thought that we were offered to take part in some operations on the territory of Hitler-occupied countries, in Poland, in France. This business, comrades, is serious and dangerous, continued the commander. That's why only volunteers will go. Unfortunately, I can't tell you more. You understand? The details will be told only to those who give their consent. I'm waiting for your answer. Where at least approximately to fight? You, someone asked. I don't know, comrades, I told you. And what is the nature of the action? I don't know either. There was a tense silence in the club. People were thinking, and the period for thinking was so short that one could consider it as if there was no time at all, and so little information about what we are being offered. Once again, I want to emphasize, the commander broke the silence, that none of you will not be sent anywhere against your will without personal consent. Only volunteers are needed, but the regional party committee believes that they will be found in our regiment. I think so too. And again silence, again frantically racing thoughts. And there came the feeling that in another minute we would all be suspected of cowardice. And though no one had yet said a word, though no one had yet refused or agreed, it suddenly seemed to me that if cowardice were to be discussed, I would be the main culprit for some reason. I sit like a stump and keep silent. I wish I knew where to go, I thought. If I knew what I should do in this damned rear, maybe it would be easier. And suddenly, in a hoarse voice and for myself, quite unexpectedly, I said, May I? I agree. I said it and immediately felt amazing relief and calmness. And in a few minutes there were already 10 names on the list. I was appointed by the commander to be in charge. Early in the morning I led my men to the headquarters of the People's Militia Division, which was located in the building of the Shipbuilding Institute. Volunteers from other divisions arrived there in small groups. Formation. A short speech of the division commander. He finished it with a message. All groups of volunteers who arrived here are united in the battalion of the Oktyabrysky district. It will be part of the 6th Fighter Guerrilla Regiment being formed now. Comrade Afanasyev was appointed commander of the battalion, and Comrade Mitrofanov was appointed commissar. I still do not know why the choice fell on me. I think that the appointment was also a surprise for our commissar. We were immediately ordered to take the cars, which were standing nearby in full readiness, and the destination was named, a secondary school on Professor Popov Street in Petrogradsky district. Here the regiment was recruited, the commander of which was appointed N.P. Petrov, Commissar Yar. A. Riveman, and the assistant commander was a border guard Senior Lieutenant V.B. Savchenko. The first order we received upon arrival was to hand over all documents. Neither party nor Komsomol tickets, neither passports nor passes. We were not to have any of these. In addition, we were warned that no one in the battalion, including us, the commanders, had the right to make any records. Official or personal, it did not matter. We were preparing to go to the rear of the enemy. But I remember that it brought me a lot of difficulties. Is it easy to get acquainted with a unit of more than 100 people without even a simple list of personnel? And it was necessary to get acquainted, and as quickly as possible. We didn't know how much time we had for training, we didn't know what we had to prepare for, but for some reason it seemed that we were about to be sent to the rear of the enemy. I tried to give as much time as possible to getting to know people. All of them were very different. Quite it seemed, boys and almost old men, young men and the elderly, students and workers, teachers and employees, engineers, scientists. There was even one elderly actor, and everyone was interested. When to fight, where will we fight, how? I was also interested in this, but except for general phrases about actions behind enemy lines, the purpose of which is to disrupt the plans of Hitler's command, we heard nothing at that time. They said, however, that we would act mainly on communications. Some time later, the commanders and commissars were summoned to the headquarters of the Army of the People's Militia. Here the conversation was already more detailed. We were told about the basic requirements that are imposed on us, schematically outlined the nature of combat operations that are to be the regiment. But the main thing that was discussed was the necessity for each of us, each soldier of our units, to think again and again about the decision to go to the rear of the enemy. It was said very insistently. It even seemed that we were specially called here to dissuade us. They repeated many times that there could be no question of any responsibility or condemnation for refusing to go behind the front line, neither on the party, nor on the Komsomol, nor on the service line. We were obliged to explain all this in our units. I remember that several people from the battalion did decide to stay. However, even without the preliminary explanations of the headquarters, I would not condemn them. 2, for example, were of age. They clearly lacked physical data and health. But here is an important moment. The command staff was summoned to the Smolny. At the entrance we were met by the head of the military department of the City Party Committee, Verkoglas. Together with him we went to the chess hall, where in peacetime meetings were held, where the bureau of the regional committee met. Now there were already commanders and commissars of the newly formed 5th Regiment. We were all waiting for Voroshilov. We had been told that it was he who would hold the meeting, but it turned out that Kliment Efremovich was delayed in one of the military units and would not be able to be there. A little time passed, and in the hall entered the secretaries of the regional committee and the City Party Committee A. Zhdanov and A. Zhajanov and A. Kuznetsov, who arrived in Leningrad together with Marshal K. Voroshilov, hero of the war in Spain, Colonel X.D. Mamsurov, several generals, staff of the regional committee. I had never seen Andrei Alexandrovich Zhdanov so closely until that day. Maybe that's why I remembered him very well. His face was pale, tired, a little swollen, bags under his eyes yellowing, and his voice was hoarse, tired. He was breathing frequently and shallowly, apparently suffering from asthma. And yet in the course of his speech he was completely transformed. The more he spoke about the situation at the front, the firmer and louder his voice became, and his movements became more energetic. The conversation began extremely simply. Zhdanov looked into the hall and suddenly turned his attention to one of the commanders. Now, I think we have already met. During the Finnish War, when volunteer ski battalions were created, it turned out to be so. Andrei Alexandrovich saw a few more acquaintances, and imperceptibly the stiffness passed. The conversation began, and until the very end it remained very confidential tone. And the subject of the conversation was terrible, because we learned from Zhdanov that our city is threatened by the most immediate danger. The enemy is already on the territory of the Leningrad region. On July 9, Hitlerites occupied Pskov and continue to rush forward. Their armies are accompanied by success. The invaders seek to develop it. Zhdanov said that the mortal danger looms not only over Leningrad. The Nazis are striving to Moscow. The entire Soviet people is threatened with enslavement. We did not think that the war could start so badly for us. We knew, for example, the song If Tomorrow is War, and according to it, it seemed that any enemy, should he only try to raise his hand on our country, will be immediately defeated. Armor is strong and our tanks are fast. But here is what is characteristic. It seemed to me that no one during the conversation in the Smolny did not lose heart, did not We have to go into battle to the most dangerous area as soon as possible, each in his own way, but it was about that. Zhdanov spoke in detail about the essence of our future actions, about the place of the guerrilla movement in the overall system of measures taken by the state to protect the country and the subsequent defeat of the enemy. Today's task, we said, is to stop the enemy troops. Hitlerites' communications must be cut. Unbearable conditions must be created in their rear. It is necessary to protect our land not only at the front, but also in the rear of the enemy. It is necessary to burn enemy warehouses and tanks with fuel. Then fascist tanks will not be able to go forward. It is necessary to blow up ammunition depots. Then the Germans will not be able to shoot. It is necessary to hit their reserves on the approach to the front line. Then they will be deprived of replenishment. We must destroy enemy vehicles and trains. Then he will not be able to move. It is necessary to blow up bridges and railroads, and the enemy will be deprived of the opportunity to supply his troops in a planned manner, will not be able to advance. Same, the next morning we received weapons, ammunition, food. The weapons were not God knows what, mostly old German rifles. Each man got a Finnish knife, for the battalion the only one, and also old. From the time of the First Imperialist War, a machine gun Louis on a tripod or P-pipe, as they called it. Several semi-automatic Simonov rifles. At night we performed. That evening we met again with Zaidanov, who came to see the regiment off. This meeting took place in the club of the Anti-Aircraft Artillery School on Mira Street. Janov's speech was short, incendiary, full of hatred for the enemy. Nowadays it is not customary to remember the words that expressed hatred, and rightly so. But then these words sounded hard and ruthless. Janov said, "You are Soviet people. That means you are humane and kind. But today you must forget pity. The enemy has come to our land, having attacked us treacherously. He is moving forward, sowing death and destruction everywhere. Thousands of peaceful, innocent people, our are dying. Old men, women, children, our fathers, mothers, wives, sons are dying. And that is why we must say, blood for blood, death for death. Your life tomorrow will be full of surprises, danger, and heroism. The motherland demands ruthlessness from you. Shoot at the fascist, beat him with a bayonet, and if the bayonet breaks, bite the beast's throat with your teeth. The Germans will call you bandits, brigands. Let them. You are the people's avengers. So let your hand never waver." He called for hatred and ruthlessness, and hatred and ruthlessness don't choose words. We applauded Zadsta, a streetcar ring not far from Leo Tolstoy Square. We load into the cars and ride through the night city and say goodbye to it. Kirovsky Prospect, Peter and Paul Fortress, Marsovo Pole, Litany, Vladimirsky, Zagorodny, everything. Vitebsk Station. It was the night of July 16. It was the 25th day of the war. Just before the train departed, some cargo was brought to us. Boxes, sacks, bags. We took it hastily, not asking what was where. We would find out on the way. And now we unpacked it all. There are grenades, fuses for them, i.e. no pots, no mugs, no spoons. Apparently in their haste, the supply men simply forgot. In the compartment of the regiment commander, I received my personal weapon, a TT pistol, but for some reason without a holster, and a PPD automatic rifle. It was the only machine gun for the battalion, and I still remember its number. They promised to give me a map of the combat area later. We had a long drive to Novgorod, the rest of the night and day. For a long time we stood at some stations and passing echelons coming from the front, which aroused everyone's keen curiosity. Alarming rumours began to spread. It became known that the Germans were somewhere near the station Dino. The fact that the enemy was already near was felt more and more acutely. At one of the stations, for example, the sight of several barrels of brinza, abandoned on the platform, unpleasantly cut the eyes. 2 of them were broken, and everyone could take as much as he wanted. In Novgorod, the commanders, commissars and chiefs of staff of the 5th and 6th regiments were summoned to the headquarters of the Northwestern Front. The chief of staff of the front, A.N.F. Evertutin, members of the military council T. Efeshnikov and V. M. Bochkov set them refined combat tasks, conducted a detailed briefing. Our regiment was assigned a sector of action on railroads and highways in the triangle Ostrov, P.P.'s scarf. Looking ahead, I must say that we, the battalion commanders, about this then knew nothing. The above is the testimony of the former head of the operational group to manage the guerrilla movement at the Military Council of the Northwestern Front, Anasmolov, somewhat clarified the picture for me, but much later in the described days, after the war. We left Novgorod at night. Commanders were given the long-awaited maps of the area and, again, disappointment. They were 5-kilometre maps, not a suitable scale, too general, but what to do. Unfortunately, there was no choice. Early in the morning we arrived in Staraya Russa. Here the proximity of the front was felt in everything. There were mangled, bombed wagons, ruined tracks, broken buildings. Our train looked like a new toy against this background, and as soon as the train stopped, we heard the alarming beeps. Air. One after another German bombers appeared above us, attacking the city and the station openly, without looking back, obviously not counting on resistance. We heard close bursts, saw the fires that broke out in the city. By some miracle, not a single bomb fell on our train, although the planes passed literally over the roofs of the cars. The raid ended. The train left Stara Russa in the direction of Dno, and almost immediately, a new attack of airplanes. We jumped out of the cars and took shelter in the woods near Mayakovo Peninsula. In front we heard bursts. They were bombing the train that was going in front of us, and high in the sky slowly, wave after wave, German bombers were heading north. The halt dragged on. It turned out that the Volat station, the nearest ahead, was full of echelons. The tracks were destroyed, and the systematic raids of the enemy aviation did not allow us to quickly carry out restoration work. Further on, we had to move on foot. Along the railroad bed, we quickly came to the area of the station Marino, where our head group met with the retreating units of the Red Army. A halt. We camped in a large clearing deep in the forest. The regimental commander and his deputy went to the headquarters of the military unit, which was somewhere nearby, and an hour and a half or 2 hours later we received the order to prepare for the march. Petrov did not explain the situation, and we had already gotten used to not asking questions. It was only announced that we would march in 30 minutes and that everything unnecessary, up to spare underwear and even canned food, should be thrown. Food should be left for 1 or 2 days. We should go light. I must say that in our duffel bags, which were swollen to bursting point, there were not only necessary things. In addition to dry rations, for example, many of us had brought from Leningrad chocolate, candy, cookies, condensed milk, and so on and so forth. And now all this flew to the ground. Our sacks became small and skinny. The main thing that was left in them now was ammunition, and though there was no talk about it, everyone was sure that the battle was already today. I mentioned the order we had received back in Leningrad, according to which none of us were to carry any documents or any records. We were not even allowed to put the situation on our maps. Everything had to be kept in memory. But in addition to this, there in Leningrad, a rule was introduced and strictly kept for a long time. No unnecessary questions. No talk about our goals. Everyone must know about the upcoming hostilities exactly as much as the command deemed. That's why nobody asked any questions at Marino. Perhaps nobody regretted that our bags were so unexpectedly and quickly thinner. It was necessary. At dusk, all 8 battalions of the regiment came to the road leading to the southeast. In clouds of dust, moving columns of retreating troops. On the clothes and the faces of tired and gloomy soldiers, lime dust. Moving artillery without a single shell. We learned that the Germans have just occupied. We are separated by less than 20 kilometers. Ahead of us on the roadside is a column of cars. They, it turns out, are intended for us. The command of the retreating 11th Army, exhausted in many days of fighting, found an opportunity to allocate trucks for our regiment. However, they were enough to transport only half of the personnel in one trip. The first 4 battalions were loaded into the trucks, taking with them the duffel bags of the remaining soldiers. In the area of the village of Yaski was appointed a meeting. The cars will return and transfer us there. The deputy commander of the regiment and the commissar left with the first flight. The commander stayed behind. 2 mistakes, one after the other, made then Petrov. The first sending with cars duffel bags of the part of the regiment which should have moved so far on foot. The second was even worse. The radio was also taken away, and the codes to it were left with the commander. If Petrov had led the first group, or if the radio had remained in the second, our situation would not have been, perhaps, so ridiculous. But all this became obvious only a few days later. Meanwhile, no one noticed these mistakes. The cars were gone. Completely light only with weapons and part of the ammunition, we stepped forward into the twilight of the white night. Our route for some time coincided with the route of one of the retreating units of the 11th Army, and we talked to the soldiers on the move, for whom it was completely unclear who we were and why we were going with them. We were asked about it, but we could not tell the truth. We answered that we were militiamen. I remember they laughed at us. They said that we were withdrawing with equipment. But where were you going with your slingshots? Then someone realized that our rifles were German from the imperialist war. There was no end of jokes against us. We kept quiet. It was a shame, but there was nothing to answer the sarcastic remarks about our equipment and armament. From behind we heard frequent car horns, and we got off to the side of the road. A car passed us and suddenly braked sharply, and the colonel sitting in it asked loudly what kind of people we were. I approached and quietly not only reported, or simply explained in a civilian militia. We are going on a special mission. Where to? I could clearly hear a sneer in the colonel's voice. Some kind of underachievers, but there you go. A special mission, no less. Then, leaning over to his ear, I said quietly, to the German rear, Comrade Colonel. Apparently, he understood everything, looked at me as if he wanted to memorize, and then said in a completely different voice, Sorry, Commander, good luck to you. Many years later, in the Leningrad House of Officers of the Soviet Army, I gave a report on the partisan movement. During a break, an unfamiliar general came up to me, and a conversation ensued. It is amazing, he said. All armies were retreating trained, equipped with equipment, and here we are met by some groups of people with lousy rifles. I remember all that. And do you know what it did to us? I was listening to the general, and I remembered that road near Marino. Perhaps we shouldn't have taken offense at the jokes back then. For the retreating soldiers, it was just a screen behind which they hid their own bitterness. They laughed at us, but in their hearts, of course, they felt not our powerlessness, but their own. In 1943, the poet Semenov wrote the following poem. When you enter your city, and women meet you, above your whitened head, they raise their children high, even if you are a hero, but don't be proud on your inauguration day. You've earned no thanks from them, but only forgiveness. Thou hast only paid the terrible debt, which you did in that time of war, when your retreating regiment sent them away for a year. At least in some respects we were happier than soldiers of the regular army. We did not surrender cities. None of us thought, of course, that if the army was retreating, it meant that it was not fulfilling its duty, but we were doing our duty sacredly. We felt ourselves to be a part of the common national organism, a part of that common force, which will certainly defeat the enemy in the end. In the meantime, we are as much responsible to the people for the retreat as the soldiers of regular units. I remember that on the same stretch of road, we overtook a group of refugees who were walking slowly. They were women, old men, children. We came upon a broken, creaking cart pulled by a skinny, gaunt. A goat was tied to the back of the cart. There was some stuff on the cart, and on the top of it was a girl of about 10. A light shawl on her head, and her eyes gleamed fearfully from under it. She, of course, does not understand the meaning of everything that is happening. She is scared and uncomfortable. Next to her is a hunched woman, staring blankly ahead and occasionally prodding the nut. From time to time, the goat stubbornly shakes its head. An old man walks along the side of the road, shouting at the horse and spurring it or the goat with a twig. The woman looks at us with sad eyes. She is pining, or maybe she sympathizes with us, or condemns us. But here the old man turns his face to us and with despair, close to anger, almost shouts. How long will you run for? We won't be able to keep up with you. What could I say to him? Nothing. And we kept silent. And on the horizon the glow of a great fire was growing stronger and stronger. The DO occupied today, as they say, by an enemy airborne landing force, was burning. The short summer night is running out. Soon the sun will rise, but there are no cars behind us. Ahead is a large village. Not reaching it, we turn to the right and settle down for rest near the village vegetable gardens. This is Big Griver. So we have passed about 15 kilometers, and no matter how you count, the cars should have returned long ago. It seems to be pointless to wait for them, however, just in case we set up a watch by the road. We reaped the fruits of the first mistake. People were hungry, and there was not a gram of food. There are more than 400 of us. There was no hope that the village, no matter how big it was, would be able to feed so many people immediately. The chairman of the collective farm gave the command to slaughter a few pigs for us. We had neither pots nor spoons. The meat was cooked in large bath pots, and each of us got a small piece of bread. As a result, we were neither hungry nor hungry. In the meantime, the sun rose, and the traffic on the highway stopped. Enemy planes hung in the sky. Now it was pointless to wait for vehicles. There was only one thing left, to move to the intended place of gathering on our own through forests and swamp. Let's go. On a beautiful rye field, we came to the position of the artillery battery. Here they had just received information about the enemy's advance, and the battery was hastily removed from the firing line. The artillerymen were retreating. Seizing the opportunity, we sent with them the last tidings to their relatives. Ahead was the territory that the Soviet troops had abandoned. We crossed a small swamp, overgrown with small bushes, and ahead on the left opened the village of Teterika, standing on the heights. The scouts reported that there were no Germans in the village, but 2 German motorcyclists had been here 3 hours ago. We decided to bypass all the villages on the way. Now we walked only on forest and swamp paths. The sun was rising higher and higher. It was getting hot. After eating pork, we were thirsty, but we had no flasks and therefore no water, so we greedily gulped down swampy-smelling but cool moisture that filled the holes from the moss sold by our heels. It was hard to walk, and many of us were soaking wet. And at the first halt among our men there were several sick men, all of whom had never mentioned their illnesses before. I do not know what played the main role for these men, whether it was the night crossing, the sight of burning Dino, the disappearance of part of the regiment, the rapidity of the enemy's advance, or simply the relative proximity of the land not yet occupied by the Germans, but they asked to go back. Well, let it be better now than there ahead. It is easier to call oneself a volunteer than to become one in reality, and the way back is not closed yet, and we did not prevent them. Meanwhile, it was already the second day of our crossing, the first and so rich in surprises. People were tired. They fell asleep instantly on short rests. This march was heavy, oh how heavy! The movement through the swamps was exhausting. We moved in column one by one, but nevertheless we left behind us almost a road of stirred bog soil, wide and very noticeable. It was especially hard for the trailing ones. The column was like an accordion. It shrank and then stretched when those who were walking in front came on solid ground, and then those who were behind had to catch up almost running. It was necessary to hurry to Yaski, to the place of meeting with the first half of the regiment, and this endless march continued. How would our soldiers behave further on? Would they not get sour? Will they hold out? These thoughts occupied me all the time. I remember how happy I was every time, seeing the energy and vigor of my deputy and combat unit Kolya Chudnov. He was young, black-haired, a little bald, a combat commander, a border guard. He was attached to our battalion in the first days of its formation. They said that in the first days of the war he had to break through on an armoured vehicle to the outpost, surrounded by the enemy and back. There they broke through quite simply, at maximum speed, unexpectedly and decisively. The enemy, to all appearances, simply did not have time to realize what had happened. But back had to move the same way. There was simply no other, and there was no need to count on surprise. Chudnov did everything that was necessary at the outpost, took a few seriously wounded in the car, and he ordered the driver to move again at maximum speed, and when the armoured car was in the zone of the strongest fire, stopped the car and set fire to a smoke bomb, which he had taken at the outpost. Thick smoke fell, and the enemy thought that the job was done. The soldiers ran to the car. Letting them close, the armoured car opened machine gun fire. It picked up speed again and broke through. Chudnov was then presented to the order. Just as calmly and confidently he acted now. He was cheerful, sociable, and liked everyone. I think that in those days a lot depended on people like Kolya Chudnov, calm, brave, judicious, and cheerful. Finally, we came to the specified area. Big break. For all, except for scouts who immediately began to search for our comrades, Very soon it turned out that Hitlerites had not come to Yaski yet. Only a few motorcyclists had been in the village. Apparently just those who were in Teterevka. However, it was felt that the advanced units of fascists will come here soon. Well, in the meantime, while the stomach was calling the shots, the soldiers are tired, they're hungry. I would like to say a few kind words to those people, about whom for some reason are not spoken almost never. The fact is that in the very first days of the guerrilla war were born very peculiar units of our detachments, regiments and brigades, units of procurers. In the nature of their activities, they had almost nothing in common with the Army Intendant Service. Most often their tasks were both economic and combat at the same time, not just to deliver food, but to repel it from the enemy, for example. These units were not just enlisted people who were efficient, thrifty, with economic experience, that is, who possessed the qualities necessary for a good supply officer. Only the bravest, most desperate people could become procurers, because their work was in fact no easier than, say, the work of scouts or saboteurs. If you happen to meet someone from the former partisan preparers, well, for example, with David Abramovich Gale, living in Leningrad, do not think that before you a man from the wagon, who did not smell gunpowder, and had the only military his concern delivery from the warehouse to the unit of meat, bread and cereals. They did it too. But we should not forget that if they went to the warehouse, it was not with a consignment note, but with a machine gun, as this warehouse belonged, as a rule, to the enemy. We had mentally stayed in the area of Yasok for a long time. The whole area around was except not probed, and to no avail. We couldn't find the first half of the regiment. Something had happened. That was clear, but what was it? They couldn't have all died, even if they ran into the enemy. And fascist units in the area had not yet appeared. We knew that for sure. At the end of the third day, Petrov decided to stop the search. Gathering the commanders and commissars of the remaining battalions under his command, he informed us that the final point of the route and the location of the regiment for the near future is the area of the villages Lutibolota, 50 kilometers southeast of Put. Believing that Savchenko and Riveman with their men were already moving in this direction, Petrov decided to go to the specified area, and at that we were to move in battalions, because the difficulties of feeding 400 men at a time and the practical impossibility of secret movement of such a unit became clear. The terrain ahead was hilly but not wooded. The routes of movement and the time of arrival at the place were determined. All surprises were taken into account. The possibility of getting lost was excluded. Maps were checked again and again. Petrov once again repeated the categorical prohibition to engage in skirmishes with the enemy, our only task, secretly and in time by July 29-31, to go to the area of Luty swamps. Only there the order for combat operations will begin. The route of my 6th Battalion was through Brodkai, Gorodovik, Bolshoi, Zapoli, Plotovets, Duby, Zadritsi, Fedovo. The 5th Battalion was to move 5-8 kilometers to the north. Even further north was the 7th Battalion. And finally, the 8th Battalion had a route along the Dino, Pieskov Railroad. The regimental commander marched with the 7th Battalion. On the night of July 23-24, we moved on the road. On the first day, the battalion went from Yasuk to the village of Gorodovik. In a straight line, it is about 17 kilometers. We passed without incident. The column was led by Anton Vinogradov, who was born, and, before going to work in Leningrad, lived for many years in the village of Brodky. Our route passed just past this village, and it was decided to make the first break that day nearby. Anton knew the terrain perfectly well and was an indispensable guide. Not reaching Brodkai 5 kilometers, we began to distinguish at first indistinct, but gradually became more and more distinct rumble of working engines. It did not stop for a minute, indicating that the column of vehicles moving somewhere was very large. Ahead was the road Chikachevo, Staraya Rusa, and our units could not be there. The feeling of proximity of the enemy was disturbing and heavy. He still remained for us something not quite real. How can you imagine something without seeing it with your own eyes? And therefore especially ominous. Everyone knows that it is the unknown that is most frightening. The people grew gloomy. Already in reality, and not only in thought, every step brought us closer to danger. It was felt that many fighters now began to really realize what was ahead of us, but no one asked to go back. Break. The loggers went to the village, the rest rested. The noise of engines could be heard nearby. From Brodky to the road was a short distance away. But now we were used to it. It did not attract so much attention. One gets used to the noise of the sea, to the howling of the wind in bad weather. And then there was a strong explosion on the road, followed by a short burst of machine gun fire and a few gunshots. I immediately sent out a reconnaissance. A little later, a German reconnaissance airplane, a Focke-Wulf, circled over the forest, almost hitting the tree tops at times. For the first time we saw the enemy plane so close, we could distinguish even the figure of the pilot in the cockpit. We camouflaged ourselves under the trees. After a while, the crutch, as the guerrillas later began to call this airplane, flew away. A little later our scouts returned. They reported that the explosion occurred near the village of Kaiburadova, when the head van of the enemy convoy drove onto the bridge over a narrow stream. It blitzed. Apparently, the car hit a mine placed by our retreating units. That's when the shooting started. Perhaps the flight of the Focke-Wulf was connected with it. However, Hitlerites quickly found out that there was no ambush. Nothing else threatened the column, and the movement resumed. In the meantime, the loggers returned. Vinogradov's relative Won, the husband of his elder sister, a little man about 55 years old, came to our forest with them on a cart with product. He told us that in Brodki there were no Germans yet, but in Kweleborodovo and other villages on the Chikachevo Stary Rus, they had already appeared 2 days ago. In Halborodovo, the peasants were first of all demanded to inform the German command about all communists and commissars. They were told that the village would be governed by a headman and appointed by the German authorities from among the inhabitants, that all orders of the German command must be obeyed immediately. If disobeyed, they would be shot. That soon the Führer's troops will occupy Leningrad and Moscow. That the Soviets had already been destroyed and Soviet Russia would cease to exist in the coming days. He said that in some villages the offended by the Soviet power, former kulaks and criminals, were already beginning to raise their heads, and the more he said, the more we learned, the more distinct became the new feeling that came just at those moments. We felt ourselves more collected, we felt ourselves, though small, but a monolithic group of Soviet people, ready at any moment to help each other, possessing the invaluable gift of mutual understanding. Before nightfall we reached the village of Gorodovik, occupied, as we already knew, by the fascists. The forest on the approaches to it ran out, so we made a big break before nightfall. I ordered to set up posts and all those who were off duty to sleep. There was a big night crossing ahead. At that time we were quite close to the road, on which the enemy column was still moving. The rumble of the engines was heard so clearly, to go was so close that I could not stand it. Taking 3 men with me and leaving Chudnov in charge, went to the noise. Shrubbery allowed to get to the road for 200 meters. Many people can easily imagine the picture we saw from the newsreel footage. The conquerors walking carefree on our land, sleeves rolled up, smiles all over the mouth, automatic rifles around their necks, cars, tanks, wagons covered with soldiers like flies, artillery, stupid huge trucks, and all of it pouring eastward in an endless stream. We saw the enemy with our own eyes for the first time. There was neither beginning nor end of the endless ribbon snake, which crawled to strangle all living things on its way. We lay by the roadside for a long time, watching and remembering, and thought it seems to me about one thing. What a pity that it is impossible to pick up a machine gun right away, and put at least one line into this boa constrictor. At night, near the village of Bolshoi Zapoli, we crossed the deserted road, crushed by the tracks of tanks and wheels of heavy vehicles, and by dawn we came to the small railroad station Plutovets. The intelligence sent earlier reported that there were no Germans at the station, but on the Bezhanitsy-Purkov highway, 8 kilometers west of Plutovets, and through this highway we had to cross. A large column was moving in the direction of Purkov. Quite a strange situation. Behind us and in front of us there was an intensive movement of enemy troops, but in the middle on the railroad there was none. I line up the battalion in column of 4, and with a song we enter Plutovets, amazed by our carelessness. From the windows people look out with anxiety, who with joy, and the ubiquitous boys cheerfully accompany the battalion through the village. I decided to enter here in this way for several reasons. First, it was not carelessness, but calculus. The enemy is relatively far away, and at the entrances and exits of the village put our combat guard. In addition, organized a fairly reliable surveillance of the railroad. Thus, no one will not enter or leave the station unnoticed. Secondly, it was urgently necessary for us not only to feed the people, but also to make food supplies for several days ahead. In Plutovets, as we knew, there was a store and a bakery, and it was one thing to enter the village sneakingly, and quite another to enter it openly. Thirdly, I wanted our fighters to feel more confident in themselves, to feel that everything that was happening was not so terrible as it might seem at first glance. And finally, I also wanted to encourage the local populace, although we are not many, but apparently I was not mistaken in my calculations. Having given the command to place the battalion in the houses of the village for the whole day, I ordered to look for the head of the cooperative. I demanded to open the storeroom. The shelves are almost empty. The manager, a man who seems to be a crook and a coward, said that almost everything had been taken out a few days ago to the forest. Running eyes, a subservient, obsequious smile, fidgeting. What he said could have been true. We were informed back in Leningrad that in the areas threatened by enemy invasion, partisan detachments and underground groups were being created from local party, Soviet and Komsomol activists. that they were laying bases of food, uniforms, and weapons. Perhaps one of such groups visited here. However, the head could not explain anything. Where did they take everything? I asked. There, I think, he pointed very vaguely to the east, where we had just come from. Either he was not trusted, or... Further conversation was useless. We started counting what little was left on the store shelves. We found 150 cans of canned meat and fish, 2 sacks of sugar, several sacks of flour, tobacco and cigarettes, about 1 packet per person. That's all. We need bread, I said to the manager. Bread, he asked me again. There is no bread. What do you mean, no bread? And the flour? There's no one to bake, and it would take time. In short, no enthusiasm. Looking at the manager point blank, I announce, You'll find the right people prepare the bakery and bake bread by evening. Our men will help. Consider it an order, and you know what happens for non-compliance. After that, the business went on as usual. While the manager was running around the village, looking for people to work in the bakery, I wrote a receipt for everything we took in the store. After about 20 minutes, he reported, barely catching his breath, that everything was in order. I handed him the receipt, and for a while he stared at it, not understanding anything. And then I had a thought. He doesn't believe he'll have to account for it. He'll fight it well, I said dryly. It'll come in handy. At that time the door opened and 2 of our guys brought in some military man. The insignia was spoiled, and it was obvious that the guy was hung over. Who is he? A sergeant, the only one from the Vinos group that was here. The others scattered when the communications went down. He says that on the highway Bezhanaitsi, Porkov in the area of the village of Dubi, columns of enemy troops are moving in a continuous stream. He himself had just returned from there and was detained by our post. Having clarified the situation, the condition of the bridge over the river Sudoma, I began to ask the sergeant if he knew anything about our retreating units and subdivisions, if he had not heard of any groups located in the forest. From his answers, based more on hearsay, it seemed that there was someone in the forests of Serbolov, but who exactly and where exactly, he does not know. We were looking for connections with partisan groups organized by local comrades, literally from the very first hours of being in the German rear. This was not only part of the task set back in Leningrad, but also could greatly ease our situation. However, the first attempts were fruitless. Having obliged the sergeant not to go anywhere from the village, I ordered him to come to me by the end of the day. I expected to use him as a guide, as he knew the way to the village of Dubi. The day passed quietly, and the men were well rested. In the evening, our battalion, again without hiding, marched out of Plotovets in formation. True, the look of the column was a little strange. We had no bags, and we left loaded with food, but it did not embarrass anyone. We assumed that we would be able to cross the broad road by morning, but it turned out that near the village of Dubai we suddenly and very dangerously got stuck. It began with the fact that at night, when the village was about 2 or 3 kilometers away, the guide disappeared. Probably he was afraid of the proximity of the Germans, but just now he was needed. On the road we would have passed perfectly well without him, but when it was time to go around the village, go to the dam of a small mill and cross the Sudoma, in other words, when it became almost impossible to do without a guide, he ran away and nearly ruined the whole battalion. The place was completely unfamiliar, open, small hills and sparse shrubbery, and it was about to dawn. There was only one way out to cross the big road, behind which there was a forest, and the movement of enemy vehicles did not stop for a minute, and to approach the highway we had to cross the Sudoma somehow. What if we tried to skip through the village? The guide assured that it was occupied by the Germans, but it might not be so. Then we could cross the bridge unnoticed. It's dangerous, but it's quick. And for us the gain of time is the main thing. In 2 hours it will be quite light. We went to the vegetable gardens behind the village and waited for the scouts sent earlier. The bridge was near. There were no guards, but it did not make it any easier. On the other side to the highway stretched only a field of ripening rye, which could not be passed stealthily. And in the pre-dawn gloom, car after car was still coming along the road, headlights on, no camouflage, and no break in this endless chain. What happened near the village of Dubai became for me one of the most disturbing memories of the first month of the war. The thing is that we were in a situation when we could not change anything, could not influence the course of events, and the question of the further existence of the battalion began to depend simply on chance, lucky or unlucky, noticed or not noticed. There is probably nothing worse than that. We waited for the return of the scouts. It became clear that this night we would not be able to cross the highway and that we should try to hide somewhere for the day. When the scouts return, we'll be on our way. Listen, Chadnov suddenly pushed me in the side. The wagons, I think, and across the field directly in our direction, were indeed moving several wagons. Soon we could already distinguish fragments of foreign speech. I gave the command to fight, realizing very clearly how senseless this fight is. The wagons passed just a few meters away from our men who were preparing to attack. It was a small detachment, and we could have dealt with it in one blow. But from there, from the highway, we would have been immediately moved to such forces against which we certainly could not resist. Fortunately, the Nazis did not notice us. They passed by, chatting merrily, and not suspecting how close death was to them at those moments. After a while, it became impossible to stay near the village. Dawn was approaching. Without waiting for the return of the reconnaissance, we went out into the field, then moved along the willow-covered stream, and further using the folds of the terrain to the only nearby shelter. It was getting light. A miracle had to happen for no one to notice us. As it soon turned out, there was no miracle. We were spotted by an old miller from the very mill, by the dam of which we had initially intended to cross the Sudoma. But we were lucky. Just at the time when he saw the battalion, our scouts were approaching the mill. When he saw them, the old man for some reason decided that they were Germans, ran out to meet them and began to shout loudly that those bushes over there were full of Bolsheviks. I don't know what guided us. Maybe he was one of those offended by the Soviet power, or maybe he was buying the invaders' favor at such a price. In any case, if he faced not our men, but Hitlerites, and the battalion would inevitably perish. The old man was locked up in the mill. They demanded that he didn't come out of there for 2 days. At the same time, they demanded him to take his dog with him and not to let it bark at night. The frightened miller complied with all these demands. In the meantime, we, not even realizing what danger we had just escaped, camouflaged ourselves as best we could in the bushes, taking up a circular defense. All we had to do was wait. The sun was rising higher and higher. Once again, I went around the posts. Everything was in order, and on the highway the engines were humming and humming. If the day passed safely, at night we would have to make a new attempt to get to the other side. Whether it would be successful, this question tormented not only me. The scouts, led by the same tireless Anton Vinogradov, found us when the sun was almost at its zenith. It turned out that they had done a lot. Not only neutralized the miller, but also found an excellent place to cross the Sudoma and the Bolshak. Immediately it became easier on soul. Everyone was visibly cheerful. And here our conspiracy was broken in the most unexpected way. In the area of the battalion location there appeared first one, then one more, and finally a whole herd of cows, which began to nibble the grass near the guerrillas lying on the ground. What could our posts do? Drive them off? Impossible. But if there is a herd, there is bound to be a shepherd, and who knows what kind of man he is. He didn't keep us waiting long. Vasily shouting at the cows, a boy of about 10 years old entered the battalion. Looking at him, one could not help recalling Nekrasov's and marching importantly, in a calm rank. He was a real man with a nail. He was wearing a tattered, probably his father's, cartouche with a cracked visor in the middle, an old overcoat, a canvas shirt, and big boots. He had a long whip in his hands and a bag over his shoulders, and it seemed that he was not in the least surprised to meet us. The boy was surprisingly independent and calm. He answered questions seriously, and very soon I was convinced that today our intelligence could rest. Everything that was necessary would be done by this boy. His awareness could not but be surprised. He knew literally everything about the Hitlerite division that had occupied the village. He counted how many tanks had passed along the highway during the last days. He added the smallest details to the information of our scouts about possible places of crossing the Sudoma and across the highway. And then, during the day, he was, as they called it, the eyes and ears of the battalion. Time has erased his name in memory. We thanked the boy at parting, but I am not sure that he understood why, and of course I don't know his fate. Today I say thank you again, on behalf of the battalion. As soon as it got dark, we were on our way again. The night was cloudy, the darkness concealed us. We crossed the Sudoma over the dam at the mill and came to the highway. The traffic here was still quite strong, but its intensity gradually began to fade. We stretched the battalion along the road and lay down in the rye field. We waited for a relatively short time, about 40 minutes. and as soon as we noticed a gap in the movement of vehicles, we rushed to the other side. In front, in 30-40 meters, was a rare shrubbery. But it is also an excellent cover in the dark. When the last of the partisans ran here, the headlights flashed again, brightly illuminating the road. By dawn we came to the Lake Leno and settled down in the adjacent forest area. Not far away was Vyshegorod, a large village in which a German garrison had already settled. About the middle of the day northwest of us began an intense firefight that lasted more than an hour. What happened, we did not find out because of the remoteness of the battle. We feared that it was one of the battalions of our regiment that ran into the Nazis, but we still could not help. The scouts, dressed in peasant clothes, as usual, all day long walked through the nearby villages. Apart from moving to the given area, the battalion had the only combat task, reconnaissance, and the guys acted. It was Sunday, July 27. In the villages on weekends are especially crowded, and therefore the appearance of our guys did not cause interest to anyone. However, in those days strangers stopped attracting attention, to only and where not went, fleeing from the war or moving towards it. The scouts learned a lot. First of all, about the location of German garrisons, their approximate number, armament. Permanent garrisons were located in Vyshegorod, Pozerovice, Porkov, Dedovici, Chikachevo, Bezhanitsy, Ostro. In the villages on our way, as well as in the final point of the route, there were no Hitlerites yet. Secondly, collective farmers told us that in the area of Zedritsy village, there were big battles recently. Some of the collective farmers visited these places recently and saw a lot of abandoned weapons and ammunition. Of course, we were interested in the weapons, and we took this information into consideration. Unfortunately, as before, we could not learn anything about the local partisans. True, the fact that the activists had left the villages gave us confidence that we would meet them, even if not today, even if not tomorrow, but it would happen. The boys had learned nothing about the shootout northwest of Vyshegorod, and it was still alarming. As for the rumours spread by the Hitlerites, they were no different from those that reached us before. As it became already habitual, with the onset of dusk, the battalion continued the march. We marched in column one by one, stretching more than 150 meters. Movement in this way for the guerrillas is most convenient, especially in those cases when it is necessary to get through fields, bushes, woods, swamps. And from the very first days in the enemy rear, it turned out by itself that we went, as a rule, in this way. Later it became clear that in addition to everything else, this order gave another advantage. When moving at night through populated areas created the appearance of several times larger groups of people than it was in fact. 20 people could be mistaken for 100, 50 for 200, and if in the night through a seemingly sleeping village passed 100 partisans, the day after tomorrow's scouts learned the undisputed judgment of the villagers. During the night there were 500 people, and it was always beneficial to us. It gave confidence to our own, frightened the traitors, and confused the occupants. Quite quickly, we reached the village of Zedritsy. It would have been possible to cover a much greater distance during the night, but I decided to delay, as it turned out that there was a lot of weapons to be collected here. The battle at Zedritsy, by all accounts, was a hot one, and neither those who were advancing nor those who were retreating apparently had enough time and energy to pick up the rifles, machine guns, and cartridges of the dead soldiers. I decided to spend the day here, especially as it was now quite clear we would be at the target exactly on the appointed date. As soon as dawn broke, we started to pack everything that could be useful in one place. Quite quickly, on a small clearing in a dense remote shrubbery, a solid arsenal was formed. Even a new anti-tank gun was in it. Almost everything could be useful, but we could carry away relatively little. Cartridges, grenades, and a machine. It was dawn. The battalion settled down for rest, and scouts Vinogradov, Gusev and Prokorsky began their usual round of the nearby villages. Valia Gusev went to the village of Linovo. When he returned and told about the results of his outing, I seriously thought, and what Gusev told me suggested very upsetting thoughts. In Linovo, Valia went into the first hut, asked for a drink. They gave him some kvass, and the conversation began. The owner of the house, an old man of about 65, spoke to him. "Where are you going, boy?" he asked. "I was at home, near Ostrov. Now I'm making my way to Leningrad." "Why to Leningrad?" "I'm studying there, at the Railroad Institute." To avert his eyes. Valia began to ask how and where it would be safe to pass through the nearby places. And you know, Comrade Commander, he told me, surprised and getting hot. The old man seemed to believe me. I felt it. He told me about his sons, showed me photos. They are all military men. Then we talked about the Germans, and when I was about to leave, he suddenly offered me a bunch of groceries and a calf. He said, "You'll take it to your own." We were spotted. The old man did not even think to believe in Valina's legend. He already knew in advance what was going on. Looking ahead, I will say that later on we were convinced many times in the amazing powers of observation of the villagers. Because of our smallest blunders in disguise, by some seemingly insignificant signs we were very often discovered at first, despite all our precautions. And how fortunate it was that they were our own men, such as the old man whom Valia Gusev had visited in Linie. We met the old man again in the evening, and he agreed to be our guide on the last part of the march. By the way, from him we finally heard at least something about yesterday's skirmish near Vyshegorod. The men who had returned from Porkov told us that the Germans had found some encircled group and dispersed it. They say that several men were killed in the firefight. The Germans captured 2 or 3 wounded men and took them to Porkov. Our guide turned out to be a very valuable man. He knew all the roads and all the paths in the area like his own backyard, so he led the battalion extremely quickly to the village of Rovnyak, surrounded by a beautiful, from our point of view, woodland, and then to the fork of the road. One led to the village of Borok, the other, here we said goodbye. And though we had no reason to distrust the old man, I ordered to take the road to Borok, not to Fedovo. We were almost there, and it was impossible to take even minimal risks. It concerned the safety not only of our battalion, but also of other units. We thought we were only hours away from meeting them. Having made a detour of 1.5 kilometers, we turned almost in the opposite direction, to Fedovo and Lutiboloti. On July 29, exactly on the appointed date, we reached the specified area, and we did not meet any of our own here, neither the first half of the regiment, nor at least one of the battalions of the second half. We began an intensive reconnaissance. Most of our men were combing the nearby forests. The scouts went around the villages, to no avail. Note: from reconnaissance on the first day were put on the construction of a line of temporary circular defence. I must say that the choice of place for the regiment's gathering was obviously unsuccessful. It became clear to us from the first hours spent here. There were no fierce swamps or fierce forests, as the name of the nearby village might suggest, small woods and groves, in which it was absolutely impossible to take shelter, especially during the period of development of the new area. For the umpteenth time, I lamented the fact that we were given 5-kilometer maps. The area where we were was marked on the map with a small green spot, the same spot in the area of the village of Rovnyak, but the conditions there are much more favorable for us. We saw it ourselves. You can't tell from a 5-kilometer map? In a word, we should fly on our maps by airplane, not guerrilla, but in that headquarters, where they determined the area of concentration of the regiment, probably did not work with 5-kilometer maps in their hands, and yet they chose this very place. The only consolation was that in a radius of 10 kilometers scouts did not find any enemy garrison. For the first 5 days we only conducted reconnaissance, and acted with extreme caution. The discovery of the enemy location of the battalion, as I have already written, threatened danger not only to us, but also to our comrades, whom we were still waiting. I forbade the scouts to visit nearby villages, acted only at a relatively great distance from the camp. As for the forests, they were thoroughly examined every day, as before, and as before to no avail. The necessity of the strictest secrecy made it very difficult to procure food. It was delivered in minimal quantities only by distant reconnaissance teams. By the 5th day we began to doubt seriously that we would meet our own people here, and still we continued our search. It seemed quite incredible that out of 8 battalions only ours had reached the specified area. On the 5th day, without stopping reconnaissance and search, we decided to conduct the first combat operation. Kuznetsov's platoon was instructed to move away from the camp for 25, 30 kilometers and organize an ambush on the Ostrovpolkov height. The task, the destruction of enemy vehicles. Silent Chain disappeared in the southwestern direction 25 people. They were given our only machine gun, the same one we took away from under Zhedritz. The deadline for the return of the platoon was determined not later than in 5 days. A reserve meeting place was determined, a wooded area near the village of Rovnyak. The days stretched monotonously. It is always difficult to wait. It was the 6th day of the search. On this day we finally received the first information about our own. But what kind of information was it? It began with the fact that our scouts brought to me the commander of the 5th Battalion Popovi. How happy I was to see him. But the joy was immediately extinguished. Popov was gloomy, confused, unkempt, looked like a beggar. I alone, what happened? The 5th Battalion, as I had already written, went north of us. They crossed the Bezhenitsy-Porkov road as well as we did, with great difficulty, but successfully. We stopped for the day not far from Vyshegorod, in a dense bush. The reconnaissance was bad, no precautions were taken, and the guard fell asleep. Suddenly, at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, machine gun bursts. Panic broke out. Someone shot back, someone ran, and quite quickly the battalion was dispersed. It was obvious that the commander himself did not remember where and how he ran away from the fire, but after a few hours he returned to the place of battle. He waited for 2 days, but none of his men returned. Then at night he went to the nearest village, changed his good clothes for some rags, and came to us. That's how the 5th Battalion ceased to exist. At the Lake Lotino we heard the sounds of this very battle. But was it a battle? Not even an hour passed, and we learned about the fate of the 8th Battalion. Another group of scouts brought 2 of its men. Amazingly, the 8th Battalion didn't exist anymore. According to those who came, the story of its death is as follows. Having crossed the Bezhenitsy-Porkov highway from the start, having come to it quite by accident at the moment when the movement of the enemy troops was interrupted for some time, the battalion apparently decided that everything would go on as easily and smoothly, completely ignored reconnaissance, moved through the settlements openly and, moreover, in almost every village began to hold meetings. There's no doubt it's a bold decision, and the task is clear to cheer up the local population. But on the first day of the march, a small group of Hitler's motorcyclists defeated the battalion with a swift blow. The survivors are now wandering in small groups in unknown places. Nothing is known about the fate of the commander and his staff, although the fighters who came to us did their best to find them. So there remains only the 7th Battalion under Skorodyumov's command. With him goes and the regimental commander with a platoon of regimental reconnaissance. The next day we heard about them. Our scouts found 2 more fighters of the regiment, this time from the regimental reconnaissance. Any luck? Not again. It turned out that the scouts themselves were lost and had been looking for Petrov for the 6th day. When they went on the mission, everything was in order. But what they said made me think seriously, gave deep concern for the fate of not only Skorodyumov's battalion, but also ours. Everything began again after overcoming the ill-fated Bezhenitsy-Porkov highway. Skorodyumov was lucky, although we crossed the highway only at the 3rd attempt, and suddenly the adjutant of the regiment commander disappeared. Someone assured that he was with the Germans. Either he ran away, or fought off on the way and was killed. It isn't new. It is possible that it was he who led the Germans to the 5th and 8th battalions, but then they may well be waiting here at the place of assembly. Maybe that's why Skorodyumov did not come here, but in this case there was another question. Why the 7th Battalion had not sent contact men to us. I decided that they had been sent for sure, but something had happened to them on the way. But no matter how you explain what happened, one thing became quite obvious. The sooner we leave here, the better. Kuznetsov was warned about the possible redeployment of the battalion near Rovnyak. In case of detection of the camp by Hitlerites and ambush, we left 2 partisans, brothers Ivanovs. Their task is to prevent Kuznetsov's meeting with the Germans. Wait exactly a week. It is with a large margin against the deadline set to Kuznetsov. Second thing that I thought it necessary to do was to try to exclude the possibility of collision with the Nazis at Luchibogs, people from other units of the regiment. Having consulted with my staff, I decided to send Makarov's platoon to the search. It was a platoon, and not a group of several scouts, because the task was difficult. Dispersed at once in Skorodyumov's battalion, and scattered groups of partisans from the broken 5th and 8th battalions, and the first half of the regiment. Makarov was given a firm deadline for the search, and the meeting place, Rovnyak. When we were leaving our first camp, inconvenient, dangerous, but it had become habitual for the past week, and therefore something even native. It became known that a motorized unit of Hitlerites was moving here. It seemed that the enemy's task was to comb the nearby places. In other words, they were looking for us. However, at the new place we could hold out only a little more than the time set for Makarov's platoon to come here. and the platoon returned. But how? Having combed the areas indicated to him, and not having met any of our men, Makarov gathered his men and led them back. But at the station Podsivy they ran into Hitlerites. In a short battle, which unfolded in the most unfavourable conditions for our guys, the platoon lost half of its composition. Makarov was one of the first to die. Skarodamov's battalion went, apparently, to another area. There was no hope of meeting him. The first half of our regiment is not nearby either. The local partisan detachments seemed to have disappeared into the water. It turned out that we were the only ones left here. If we had then had a connection with the Soviet rear, we would have known that northeast of Pskov operates a small 24 people, a detachment of students of the Leesgaft Institute under the command of F.O. Kositsin. We would have known about the actions of the 5th Partisan Regiment under the command of K. P. Volovich. We would have known where Skarodumov's battalion had gone. We would have known, finally, that the first half of our regiment under the command of Savchenko also operates, and not so far away. But there was no communication. The only thing we had was the results of our own search, very vague information about some armed groups based allegedly in the area of the Sobolovsky forests. All terms of return from the task of Kuznetsov's platoon had long expired. There was nothing to wait for near Rovniak. The decision to go to the area Sobolovsky forests was the only, in our opinion, reasonable. But this time we could not get away without a fight. We were discovered, of course, not by chance. The fact is that a few days before, one of our groups had destroyed a heavy transport vehicle on the forest road, moving from the south towards Rovniak. This could not but provoke a response. It was about 2:00 in the afternoon. All the personnel of the battalion were in the camp, except, of course, those who were in secrets and on guard posts. Suddenly, near the road, which passed about 1 kilometre from the camp, began an intense firefight. The battalion raised an alarm, took up a circular defence and prepared for battle. A few minutes later, a liaison officer appeared and reported a company of Hitlerites entered the woods, obviously intending to comb the forest. The side guard of the enemy discovered our secret. A firefight ensued. The company turned into a chain and is moving now in the direction of the camp. So the battle is in. When combing the forest, Hitlerites almost always used one technique. They went in a chain until the time of growth and at the same time not sparing ammunition, pouring fire on everything ahead of them, and so until the enemy was detected. We were lying in a thick thicket of alder on the edge of a large clearing, which allowed us to see perfectly the movement of the enemy's chain, a winning position in itself. Besides, the abundance of large rocks, hollows, and other natural shelters made it possible to have many excellent firing points. Already the tops of thin, tall young trees began to sway here and there, continuous shooting at random. On the foliage, as if sharply beaten with a giant whip. These are bullets in the forest. The sound of their flight is very characteristic. From time to time one hears fragments of some commands. Here in the bushes at the edge of the forest the figures of soldiers flickered. An officer appeared, gesticulating sharply, giving commands. We waited for the Hitlerites to come out into the clearing and poured all the fire we could on them. The fight did not last long. Stunned by unexpected and so energetic repulse, the company of the enemy not only did not continue the attack, it simply fled. On the clearing remained 12 killed Hitlerites, including an officer. This was the first battle of the battalion. Needless to say, what excitement we experienced before it and what joy. Having won, our men became more confident, more cheerful. It turns out that we can not only hide from the enemy, but also take his attack and chase him. And this is just the beginning. Time will pass, we'll get used to the new place, we'll find our own, then we'll beat not a lousy company, but fascist regiments. Everyone thought about it, and it was as if we had more strength. Several days passed. We went into the woods to the west of the railroad known as Novosokolniki, and more often we began to receive information from the population about partisans in the Sobolovsky forests. They reported that even a whole cavalry regiment was operating there. The rains began to linger. They brought with them impenetrable darkness at night, and the field roads turned into a solid mud. We followed the route we already knew, only in the opposite direction. Dubai, Plotovets. Here, at the semi-station, without meeting any resistance, we broke the communication line, disrupted the equipment in the station room, the switchboard. The next day we reached the village of Lebyaz, and here we finally received accurate information about the partisans. In Makarevo, peasants baked bread for them, and therefore will help our meeting. Our odyssey was coming to an end. We did not know yet that our long wanderings had brought us to no one else but to Savchenko.